You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall with Newshour. The level of greenhouse gas emissions reached a record high last year, which is bad news for humankind and bad news for world leaders who last year agreed to try to limit the global rise in temperature to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. The chief economist of the International Energy Authority, which made the calculation, called for bold, decisive and urgent action very soon. Mary Robinson is a former president of Ireland who now heads the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice.
I think this report is the kind of wake-up call we've needed. People do tend to rely on the International Energy Agency. It's a very reliable evidence source. And the fact that the chief economist and others in the IEA are shocked at the result that they have found in the volume of greenhouse gas emissions is, I hope, going to remind us that we have a huge responsibility and that we need now to focus on what is going to happen as we prepare for the Durban COP17. Like many others, especially developing countries and Europe, I believe we need to have a pathway to a legally binding agreement that is fair. And I believe it's doable. I believe we just need a different conversation where we urgently address this and where we stop talking about bottom-up countries deciding what they will do. That's not going to work. Countries won't volunteer what we need. The exigencies go way beyond that.
Is it time maybe to accept that if you're going to achieve a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, it's unlikely to happen in a world of democracies?
I think there needs to be a real sense of urgency among those who have the responsibility of leadership, and they will be in both democratic and in countries that are not so democratic. But we all live in the same world, in the same planet. Developing countries need a right to development. But we've used up a lot of this carbon budget, and now we need to find ways of having a growth and opportunities without adding to the carbon. But there's no doubt that this is a real warning for us. And there has been a certain drift in the debate after Cancun put the focus back on a UN possibility of resolving and addressing these issues. We've begun to drift again. I think this is now another wake-up call, and I hope that South Africa in its leadership and developing countries and countries where there is a concern about the future of this planet will really begin to say we have to have a legally binding agreement, and it has to be a fair one.
That was Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, and I've been discussing those rises in greenhouse gas emissions with Lord Stern, professor at the London School of Economics and the author 5 years ago of an influential report on the economics of climate change for the British government, and Stephen Tindale, an associate fellow at the Centre for European Reform and climate and energy consultant. Him first. Mary Robinson said this was a wake-up call and legally binding targets were urgently needed. Does he agree?
I agree that it's a wake-up call. Legally binding targets would be great, but they are very unlikely to happen. And the danger is that politicians and journalists and everyone else campaigners will just focus on the Durban summit and not focus on what I think is more important, which is finance. Money is more important than targets and timetables, and we need to mobilise enormous amounts of money, much more than was spent on saving the world banking system. Saving the banking system may be important, but saving the global climate and humanity from the effects of runaway climate change is much more important. So we urgently need much more money.
Lord Stern, has the international process to curb global warming failed?
It hasn't failed. It's going to slowly. The Cancun agreement, which essentially consolidated the target numbers that had been set out in the so-called Copenhagen Accord, was an important, if modest, step forward. If we did see the delivery from all the countries who set out their targets for the Cancun agreement, we would be back 10 years from now to roughly the level of emissions that we are today. It would still be too high. We really need to take 10% off today's levels by 2020. But the Cancun numbers, if everyone delivered, would bring us back to roughly where we are today, which is not big enough, but a lot better than nothing. So I don't think it's right to say it's failed, but I think it is right to say the progress is far too slow. And I hope that the estimates on CO2 emissions from energy sources put out by the International Energy Agency, or coming out to the International Energy Agency, I hope those numbers will really wake people up, because they're showing we're on a path that really is very dangerous indeed. Indeed, if we go on something like business as usual, we would probably be heading to something like a 50-50 chance of 4 degrees centigrade, which we've not seen increase relative to the 19th century, which we've not seen on this planet probably for tens of millions of years.
Stephen Tindale, isn't the international political process essential to persuade democratic countries to vote for economically painful policies?
These policies do not need to be economically painful. As the Stern Review memorably and correctly said, the price of dealing with, I can't remember the exact words, Lord Stern will correct me, but the price of dealing with climate change is lower than the price of not dealing with it. So the economically disastrous way forward would be to allow runaway climate change. There will be a transitional cost, that is correct, but once we have developed renewable energy, once we have got more low-carbon energy sources, including carbon capture and storage, and including, in my view, nuclear power, should be part of the way forward, we will have much greater energy security. We won't have to be nice to hostile countries overseas, or even invade hostile countries overseas in order to get their energy sources. So there is a major economic benefit from the low-carbon transition.
Lord Stern, why have politicians, it would appear, failed to make that argument with their constituents?
It's starting to come. The point that Stephen Tindale made, that this is a story of real economic benefit from strong action, is crucial. And it's not simply the huge benefits we get from cutting the risks of climate change by reducing emissions. It's more than that. We are embarking now on an energy and industrial revolution, which is creative and innovative, and the pace of discovery now is really quite extraordinary, whether it be in renewables, electricity, storage. Costs are coming down very rapidly. So this is a story of the low-carbon growth story, which is the only growth story. High-carbon growth kills itself. So to try to set it up as economic pain versus climate responsibility is actually to miss the point and get the economics wrong.
OK, Stephen Tindale, isn't it time that, certainly in democracies, politicians stopped listening to the voters and told them what should be done?
Yes, up to a point. Leadership is needed. We elect politicians partly because we want them to listen to us, but partly because we want them to show leadership. And in the United Kingdom, to be fair, Chris Huhne, the Energy and Climate Change Secretary, has shown some leadership and is doing some good things on carbon capture and storage, not nearly enough, but not bad, and on renewables and on nuclear power. So I think in the UK we are seeing some leadership. In Germany, the government has unfortunately shown no leadership since the Fukushima incident in Japan. Angela Merkel has reversed her policy on nuclear power and said they'll all have to shut by 2022, which is a big mistake.
Lord Stern?
It's likely on the nuclear issue that China will have, in the next 20 years, an additional 200 nuclear facilities, each of about a gigawatt, and that's where the big expansion in nuclear is likely to take place. India probably also. I suspect in the UK will continue. I think in France we will continue. So we do need a slice of nuclear. It will probably be the order of 5 or 10% of the total action, and we are going to need that.
That was Lord Stern, a professor at the London School of Economics, and I was also speaking to Stephen Tindale, Associate Fellow at the Centre for European Reform.